There once was a man from Nantucket whose... I can't say that, can I? Stick around to the end and I'll recite the whole thing for you. So I said in the last video that we were going to have to figure out what happened to the whales, but in order to go forward, we kind of have to go backward a little bit to like the Revolutionary War. Okay, I guess that's going back kind of a lot. Anyway, by the time of the American Revolution, Nantucket whalers were already like traveling the globe looking for whales because, like I said, they had pretty much demolished the local population of right whales, which is what they were hunting initially. They were called right whales because they were the right whales to kill. Because they were docile and easy to kill, that made them the right whales, right? But now, Nantucket is pursuing sperm whales, which are just about the opposite. They're not easy to kill, they're aggressive, they're much faster, and you gotta go farther to get them. So they need bigger ships. Not only because the whales are different, they need bigger ships, but also because now they got to do the rendering on the boat because they're not close enough to shore to drag the carcasses ashore. So they really need a big boat because they're going to be rendering a whale. Yeah, they need a big boat. Now comes the war. We're going to fight for our independence. Nantucket by this time, well, they felt kind of special and untouchable, and they decided they're going to stay neutral. They didn't want to go against the British because the British were good customers for whale oil, for one thing. And, you know, again, there's that whole thing where, hey, we're not part of any of this. They kind of pulled out the Quaker card and said, well, we're pacifists. We're not going to go to war. But some of the towns on the mainland boycotted Nantucket. They lost a little bit of business. Not that much, though, and not enough to cause any kind of permanent slowdown. The War of 1812 was the next war that came up. That one was a little tougher because there were British blockades that physically prevented the ships from going where they needed to go. But again, by 1819, they're back on top again. You know, they've got it sewn up. 1819 is also the year that the Essex, which is a Nantucket whaling ship, gets sunk by a sperm whale, which inspired Herman Melville to write Moby Dick. Now, if you're somebody who's like laboring in pursuit of something creative, like maybe a YouTube channel, then you just feel like, you know, there's never any return, there's never any sign that you're going down the right road, think about Herman Melville and Moby Dick, because that book was, you know, I mean, it was just not really looked at as anything when it came out, but by the middle of the 20th century, it's being hailed as one of the greatest American novels ever written. So, yeah, of course, Melville was dead by then, probably for a pretty long time, so maybe forget I gave you that example. 1840 was kind of the beginning of the end, because by now the ships are getting bigger. The harbor in Nantucket is very shallow, and it also has a sandbar that's kind of unpredictable that goes through it. Now, the harbor has started to gradually fill up with silt. People are starting to look at New Bedford and Salem, which have unobstructed paths to the ocean. It's kind of a gradual thing. What happened in 1846, though, was not gradual. It was very, very fast. It started in a defective stovepipe in the hat store, spread very quickly until it got all the way down to the wharves where barrels of whale oil were being stored. As it caught fire, it poured into the harbor, creating what one eyewitness called a sea of fire. It only took 7 hours for the entire commercial district to burn. The warehouses, the shops, homes. There were 800 people left homeless. The entire infrastructure was gone, you know, with the warehouses. With the wharves themselves were burned. Candle factories, blacksmith shops. Tough to recover from, for sure. (1849) California Gold Rush. You wouldn't really think that would affect Nantucket, but think about the kind of guy who's going to Nantucket and getting on a whaling ship. And those guys started going to California instead because doesn't it seem a little easier to like jiggle a pan than to go out and slaughter a whale? Besides that, even men who were on Nantucket, who lived on Nantucket, were leaving to go to the gold rush. It seemed like the place to go. 1852, an even bigger blow. A patent is filed for kerosene. Kerosene's a pretty good fuel. It's easy to produce, it's cheap, it doesn't require slaughtering a leviathan. Factories start making kerosene. Then in 1859, petroleum is discovered in Pennsylvania, so that makes it even easier. Wartime again. this time the Civil War, and Nantucket is not going to stay neutral on this because the island, with its Quaker tradition, has long fought for abolition. 400 Nantucketers go off to war. 75 of them don't return. A lot of the whaling ships are pressed into service for the Union. Some of them are raided and looted by the Confederates, and then still more are sunk on purpose to create blockades. So at the end of the war, in 1866, 105 whaling ships go back to the sea. This is down from 199 before the war. Within a decade, though, they're almost all gone. In 1869, Nantucket's last whale ship leaves the harbor forever. It's over. Nantucket's days as Emperor of the Ocean are over. Time to find something else to do. Right from the beginning, there were people who saw the writing on the wall and turned their vision toward tourism, and they were mostly looking to Martha's Vineyard for inspiration, because Martha's Vineyard had this section called Cottage City, where all these little gingerbread houses, which were popular at that time, they were modern then, in Victorian times. They were springing up. This is what Cottage City, which is part of Oak Bluffs, looks like today. But the thing is, Cottage City kind of grew up organically. It was born out of a place called Wesleyan Grove, which was a Methodist revival camp. It started out with communal tents, and then people started putting up more individual tents. That led to building these cottages, and pretty soon you had Cottage City. So Nantucket real estate speculators decided that they were going to copy this, and they bought these tracts of land and divided them up into little chunks to put cottages on, and they advertised them for sale. But it didn't work. No one bought the plots, no one built the cottages, it just didn't work. Tourism worked, though. There were 10,000 people who came in 1880, just nobody wanted the cottages. Everybody was staying in hotels and boarding houses. The exception to this was a group of rustic cottages in Sconset. They weren't these little gingerbread numbers. And this became home to the Actors Colony eventually. It just quickly became clear that the Nantucket tourist was just kind of like a different kind of tourist. One writer in the 1880s, Jane Austen, called Cottage City the paradise of the commonplace, and says it's the perfect place for the happy grocer and his family to vacation. And then she says it's basically a circle of hell for the aesthetic, which is what she considered herself, an aesthetic. She talks about taking the steamship over, and 4/5 of the passengers get off at Oak Bluffs, while the 1/5, the adventurous, the discerning, the special 1/5 continue on to Nantucket. So you see, elitism has been part of Nantucket tourism right from the beginning. Almost all the people who visited Martha's Vineyard were from New England or maybe New York, but it wasn't uncommon on Nantucket to find people from all over the country. They were educated, they were artistic, they were entrepreneurs. The tourist on Nantucket was a little bit more urban, which makes sense because Nantucket was kind of like an urban place in a rural setting, surrounded by the roughness of the island. The tourist brochures that Nantucket put out emphasized nature and activity, things like fishing and stuff like that. But when literary people would come to the island, and they came a lot, they would write about the beauty of this bygone place, about its quaintness, but also about its darkness, with this big bloody past that was looming. Because what was Nantucket at that point but a pile of ruins? The wharves hadn't been rebuilt since the fire. Everywhere you looked, there were symbols of both the grandeur and the decay of the whaling industry. The islanders hadn't really pieced it together yet, but that faded glory was going to become a big part of the special sauce. A combination of economic downfall, the difficulty of getting building materials to the island, and just plain old apathy had resulted in there being a lot less revitalization on Nantucket than in other parts of the country. Everywhere across America there was a lot of tearing down the old and building up the new, and that wasn't really happening there. And that turned out to be great for tourism because as a result, Nantucket ended up with 800 pre-Civil War buildings, the largest collection in the entire country. The Nantucket Historical Association was formed in 1894. They would be responsible for most of the preservation, including the oldest house, which they completed in 1923. 1923, that is the year a certain 5-year-old boy first set foot on Nantucket. Who is that 5-year-old boy? I'm talking about Walter Bud Beinecke. Beinecke Jr. Walter Bud Beinecke. Beinecke. I'm not sure if he was called Bud when he was that young, but he, as a 5-year-old, was a sickly kid who was suffering from a childhood illness called mastoiditis, which was basically like a life-threatening ear infection. He lived in New York City at the time where it was humid and just kind of gross in the summertime, so the family doctor recommended rest and fresh air as the cure. They didn't have antibiotics or anything else then. That's pretty much what they had. So they borrowed a friend's summer cottage in the Sankaty area of Nantucket. Yeah, look at that and tell me that you'd call that a cottage. That ain't no cottage in my world. But anyway, they liked it so much that they eventually bought the place, and that was the summer home of Bud Beinecke through his entire childhood. The Beineckes could pretty much do what they wanted because Dad had just taken over the S&H green stamp fortune. How many of you remember S&H green stamps? I do. That's partly because I'm old and partly because my parents worked in a grocery store. But they were little, green stamps that you could use to get stuff. They were very popular in their time. In the 1940s, he took his own young family to Nantucket, and they didn't stay at Sankaty, probably because his parents were there. They rented a house in Nantucket town, and that's when things really came alive for Bud. He never really was much of a beach guy, so walking around downtown, that's when he really fell in love with Nantucket. In the 1950s, Beinecke founded with 2 other guys an organization called the Nantucket Historical Trust. And it's not a well-known organization today, although the name is very similar to some of the other groups that do exist. But what they were founded to do initially was to stop the turning of a private home at 72 Main Street into a bar. And they succeeded. It's still a private home today. They went on to do a whole bunch of that. They'd buy a house, they would restore it, and then they would sell it to somebody who promised to preserve it and live in it. The organization would go on to receive awards and praise outside of Nantucket, but not a lot of recognition on island. Also, they helped to found Preservation Institute Nantucket, which is it's a learning laboratory of the University of Florida that exposes participants to the theories and methodologies of international cultural heritage conservation. That's from their website. Beinecke wasn't the only person on Nantucket that was interested in preservation work, though. It was starting to be a really hot topic. In 1955, a local historic district was created, and a year later they created the Historic District Commission, which was responsible for overseeing construction and renovation from a historic perspective. Unfortunately, they only had control over the exterior of homes and not the interior, and that's going to become pretty significant in the future. Now, this is where all the gray shingles came from. I have to admit that when I first saw Nantucket, I thought that some petty bureaucrat control freak who was really anal just wanted the whole place to look the same, and that's why they all had the gray shingles. But once you kind of dig into it, you start to really appreciate that the shingles are, instead of being pretentious, they're really what's keeping it real, and they're part of what makes it this living, breathing organism that it is. The Nantucket we see today is largely the vision of Walter Beinecke Jr. That's a quote from Michael May, who's the executive director of the Nantucket Conservation Trust. Okay, saying that, it's kind of a double-edged sword because the Nantucket we see today is both prosperous and perilous. Beinecke was involved in all this preservation work, but he wasn't the only one. So what would make him say that? Did Beinecke really create the two sides of that coin? Well, one thing that's clear is that Beinecke did have a plan for Nantucket, and that plan involved his 2 favorite things, which were historic preservation and making money. Beinecke's plan was to buy up as much of the island as he could so that he could preserve it and restore it. So to that end, he bought up about 80% of the island's commercial space, jacked up the rents, which shoved out a bunch of mom and pop shops. He quainted up the storefronts and put in some really high-end stores there. Then he bought the wharves and he put all kinds of retail in down there. Then he built a really fancy marina that would attract yacht owners. And since now he owned the piers, he went to the ferryboat companies and he told them that they couldn't use the piers unless they agreed to raise their prices and do less trips, which means it would be bringing less people to the island. He wanted to make sure that Nantucket was never going to be the paradise of the commonplace, that place for the happy grocer and his family. By July of 1968, Beinecke owned pretty much every downtown store, 5 inns, and 2 of the 3 gas stations in town, among many other things. Needless to say, this didn't really endear him to the locals, and there were campaigns against him that had buttons made up. One said, "Ban the bee," and another one said, "No man is an island." One of the few buildings that Beinecke didn't buy is the building where Murray's Toggery is located, and Murray Stoggery is the home of Nantucket Reds, which are these pants that everybody's wearing. But what exactly was the vision? I mean, what did Beinecke think he was going to accomplish in terms of preservation by monopolizing the local real estate? Well, it's pretty simple when you think about it. Number one, by making the place an exclusive place that only rich people could come to, he was reducing the number of people who were going to come, which makes less strain on the resources of the island. Number two, he was making sure that the people who do come can afford to pay for the damage they cause, because feet on cobblestones wears down the cobblestones. So you got to have people who can pay for new cobblestones. He told Time magazine in 1968, instead of selling a hot dog and 6 postcards, you have to sell a hotel room and 2 sports coats. Number 3, he was hoping that all this would increase the value of his own property. So did he succeed? In many ways, yeah. In other ways, well, let's take a look and try to figure it out. Day after day, airplanes and ferry boats drop off hundreds of people, but probably not as many as there would have been had Beinecke not done his thing. Because the people they're dropping off are people who can afford to be here. It's expensive to get here, so the people who come are the ones who can pay for their cobblestones. You're not going to see too many of this guy, but you're going to see a lot of these people. And their pants, which, hats off to Murray, he certainly made his mark. The marina attracts wealthy yacht owners just like it was intended to. As we walk down Beinecke's Wharf, we see all these little buildings along the side, and they're, I guess, meant to look like fishing shacks, but they're perfect for selling t-shirts and postcards, things tourists buy, and they do buy them. The people who sell them pay the exorbitant rent, but Beinecke's not the landlord anymore. He sold his holdings in 1987 to First Winthrop, and they in turn sold it to Jill and Stephen Karp, who are mall developers with no connection to Nantucket, no real interest in its preservation. So after all those years of restoring homes and then selling them to people who promised to be good stewards of those homes, he basically just handed the entire island to people who didn't make that promise. Beinecke might have priced out a few mom and pops, but with Karp, yeah, they're all gone. He bought both the rent and the price of merchandise from the high to the preposterous. He's also trying to make the downtown merchants all stay open the same exact 10 hours, 7 days a week, and that kind of sounds like he's turning Main Street into a mall. That makes sense, he's a mall developer, but the charm of Nantucket is that it's not the mall. I know that, and I'm just a tourist in a bus, and he owns half the property here, so if he doesn't know it, then yeah, that doesn't bode well. When I was here 25 years ago, you had to go to the mainland to buy a TV. Now you can order one on Amazon, and that's pretty much the only way that the locals here can afford to even buy a nice dress, because they certainly can't afford it in these stores. And being a local shop owner, yeah, with very few exceptions, I would say that is a thing of the past. A lot of people can't afford to live here anymore. People who are pretty vital to the community. Emergency personnel, teachers, veterinarians. What do you do without those people? So, preserve the buildings, weaken the community. I'm not sure that that's an appropriate trade-off. So maybe the whole thing was all about money. Maybe that's all that Beinecke ever wanted out of this. But just when I start thinking that way, I run across these pictures, these before and afters of the wharves, and it's stunning. It's miraculous. Yeah, it's profitable too, but I don't know, as far as Nantucket goes, it's kind of life-saving. So I have to believe that someone who loved Nantucket this much would not knowingly take it down the wrong path. I prefer to think that it was just kind of a simple human mistake. By making Nantucket an elite place to come, Beinecke was just tapping into what the island already was, right? I mean, we saw that back in the 1800s with the self-selected elites who were sailing past Oak Bluffs to come to Nantucket. But that was not about money. That was about, I don't know, maybe an intellectual elitism. Certainly not a financial elitism, because the actors came here, okay? Actors don't have money. But by making it about money, Beinecke was assuming that he was inviting the right people to come to the party. Maybe he just thought people would be content with visiting and renting those hotel rooms. Maybe he just didn't predict that everybody would want a piece of the place. He thought that they would stomp on his beloved island less than those hot dog eaters would, but you know, what's worse? Wearing down the cobblestones or gutting the inside of a 200-year-old house? Because that's what's happening now. The wealthy or not, these erudite patrons that Beinecke maybe thought they were, they're just people with a whole bunch of money. People want what they want, you know, and if you want a cathedral ceiling and an open floor plan inside of a 200-year-old house, you're going to find an architect on Nantucket who will give you that. The Historic District Commission can't stop it because they don't have control over interiors, only exteriors. So, yeah. Did Beinecke succeed? Well, in an interview, his daughter said that he would be appalled by what's happening right now. But I have to say, I think he had a hand in it. He had a hand in a lot of wonderful, wonderful things. But he had a hand in this too. So what's next for Nantucket? When I was doing my research for this, I found an editorial written in the late 1800s that was talking about how so many people come to Nantucket, so many people want to be here, that Nantucket isn't Nantucket anymore. That sound familiar? Yeah, it sounds just like that editorial about the island that's being loved to death. So here's what I know about the residents of this island. I know that they are badasses both historically and in the present tense, and I know that they've been ahead of the curve a lot of the time, and they learn lessons deeply. And yeah, they've had some lessons that they've had to learn deeply because they started out by decimating their own island by overgrazing. Then they go out to sea and they kill off the whales almost to the point of extinction. So yeah, but somehow they come out of all that as innovators in the field of preserving both the natural and the built environment. And that's not small. That's pretty big. So I'm thinking maybe they can figure this out. And that's about as optimistic as I'm going to get. I don't have the answers. Neither did Beinecke. Now I gotta go because I have a ticket on the freight boat out tonight back to the mainland. Gonna miss this beach.